Well, Australia has a few great exports in human capital, and very high on the list would be New York-based Sir James Wolfensohn, a former two-term head of the World Bank. Sir James has been in Sydney to give a speech at the Asia Society's annual dinner, and as I found out, Asia is very much on his mind. Sir James Wolfensohn, thank you so much for joining us.
Great pleasure, thank you.
Now, you've come over here with a shirt-fronting statistic that 60% of global GDP will come from Asia in the next 4 decades. And I get the impression that you feel that Western countries simply don't get it and that they're very focused on their own current economic challenges as opposed to future reform. What do you mean by future reform?
Well, I think it's very clear that today the Western countries are facing great problems of internal growth. And until the year 2002, they dominated the world. They had 80% of the world's income. And after that, it just started to change a bit, and people started to recognize that China and India and Asia were taking a bit of their business. What is likely is that we will have, by 2050, a world in which a lot of that business has moved to Asia, probably of the order of 50 to 60%. And even beyond the economic science, the Asians are preparing for it. They're sending their students to our universities. They're visiting. The Premier of China visits much more than we visit Asia in terms of the collective of the West.
You see education as crucial, don't you, in terms of keeping up?
I see education as really the foundation. And if you have the young people of Asia really educating themselves on what's happening in the West, and we're not educating ourselves on what's happening in China and India, and by the way, we never have, it really is a heavy burden to pay. And that's why it'll just go ahead, in my opinion. They also work very hard.
You're a great supporter of getting our Western children to learn Mandarin. Now, if I take my son, who's 4, and here in Australia, in his generation, there will be many Chinese Australians. Your old alma mater, Sydney Boys High, is a classic example of that. Why wouldn't, for him, Spanish, say, be better?
Well, he might enjoy Spanish. It's a great language. But if he wants to get into business, if he wants also to be part of the region's dynamics, he'd be crazy not to learn Mandarin.
And this is because we've often talked about Australia deciding whether it wants to be Western or Eastern. Is it as black and white as that?
In view of Australia's location and its proximity to Asia and the possibility of being a bridge between the West and Asia, it seems to me that it's a unique opportunity for our country to fill that role. And if we can get our young people to feel just as easy about going to Beijing or Shanghai or to Delhi or wherever as going to Oxford and Cambridge and to the Sorbonne, it seems to me that in the world of the future, that would be both interesting and also a tremendous opportunity for our young people.
Of course, the standards of Chinese universities are going up very fast, aren't they?
They're enormous.
To Africa now. China's relationship with Africa is very interesting, and I know you're on the International Advisory Council for the China Investment Corporation. What drives sovereign fund investment in places like Africa? Is it returns, resource security, or is it a keenness for more political influence, do you think?
No, the financial institutions in China, to my experience, do not have a political agenda. But they do have an agenda to get natural resources. They do have an agenda to get markets. And in the case of Africa, the Chinese in 10 years have put 1 million people to live there. So you have 1 million ethnic Chinese now living in Africa, building not just the town halls and the public spaces, but building roads and also securing mines.
I would love to ask you about the Dodd-Frank's rule and the Dodd-Frank's Act, and in particular the Volcker rule, because, of course, Paul Volcker was one of your partners. There is some grumbling amongst investment banks, I know, in the States, and questions about whether this will hamper recovery in the United States. What's your view?
Well, I think the anxiety is mainly with the commercial banks that have investment banking affiliates and are active. And very simply, what these two bits of legislation want to do is to separate the deposit-taking institutions and say, if you make a deposit with a bank, it's safe because they're not going to speculate with it. Whereas if you go to an investment bank, they can speculate, they can do whatever they like, but at least then you know what you're dealing with. And I think what Dodd-Frank is doing and what Paul Volcker is doing is to say, listen, guys, let's go back to a more standard situation in which banks are banks, investment banks are investment banks. If you want to invest in an investment bank, do so. But if you want to make a deposit and ensure that it's safe, do it in a commercial bank. And in the commercial banks, you can have a small amount of this speculation, but it's very small. My own judgment is that that is not only entirely reasonable, it is obvious, and it has to happen now. And I think it's in the course of happening.
Sir James, you don't come back to Australia nearly enough. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, if you ask me, I will certainly come back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.